There are boycotts that need no protests, no slogans, no one speaking out. Yet they still shake an entire economy to its core. In just a few months, millions of Canadians have quietly turned their backs on American products, not out of hatred, but out of lost trust. And when trust is gone, a burger, a pair of shoes, or even an electric car can become a symbol of rejection. This is no longer about consumption. This is a warning. When Canadians quietly turn away from America. Something strange is happening north of the border, something the United States has yet to understand and perhaps doesn't want to. There is no official announcement, no ban, no angry crowds waving signs, and yet a quiet and determined withdrawal is taking place, from supermarkets, restaurants, even the smartphones in people's pockets. Canadians are saying no to American products, and they don't need to shout to be heard. They simply stop buying. We are witnessing a form of resistance that makes no noise, but carries great weight. Resistance by choice. A choice repeated every day, every time a consumer walks into a store, looks at a product, and turns away. Nothing is more painful for an economy that once prided itself on American quality being a global guarantee than to face a question now arising in the minds of consumers. Do I still believe in that? For over a century, Canada has been America's closest market, not just because of geography, but because of cultural similarity, shared consumer habits, and a long history of economic partnership. People on both sides of the border once saw each other as neighbors, in the best sense of the word. A car built in Detroit was quickly sold in Toronto. A soda bottled in Georgia was stacked high on shelves in Vancouver. No flashy advertising needed. Just the label, Made in USA, was enough to evoke trust in quality, in the American lifestyle. But those very foundations are now cracking. Canadians aren't turning away because American goods are low quality. They're not stepping back out of hatred for Americans, but because, in their eyes, the brands that once symbolized familiarity now reflect something foreign. Arrogance, imposition, and disrespect. From American corporations shutting down factories in Canada to seek cheaper labor elsewhere, to trade policies that feel one-sided, Canadian consumers no longer feel like partners. They feel like disregarded customers. This loss didn't happen overnight. It began with small incidents, a price hike with no explanation, a policy enforced without consultation, a brand leaving and returning as if it never left. Trust, the invisible glue of commerce, wasn't stolen but eroded, bit by bit. And once it collapses, no marketing campaign can restore it. The irony is that America was once a master of building brands based on emotion. From Coca-Cola to Nike, McDonald's to Netflix, they didn't just sell products, they sold a dream, convenience, innovation, personal freedom. But an over-reliance on that image made them blind. They believed being beautiful was enough, that being famous meant being forgiven. But they forgot that emotion, too, can resist. And when consumers feel that dream no longer reflects their values, they wake up and walk away. Canada isn't rebelling. Canada isn't threatening. But as its people gradually remove American brands from their meals, their footsteps, their screens, and even their weekend joys, they are sending a message louder than any political declaration. We no longer believe in you. For America, the real fear is not losing a market. It's losing a friend who always supported you in silence. When Canada starts asking questions, the rest of the world will begin to doubt. And in a world where competition is no longer about price, but about principle, once trust leaves, no one knows if it will ever return. When American brands are no longer loved, trust, once fractured, makes no sound. But its consequences echo far and spread wide. After Canadian consumers began turning their backs on the Made in USA label, What followed was not just an economic withdrawal, but the collapse of a symbol. Brands once beloved, once tied to memories, habits, even consumer identity, are now being replaced without a farewell. This shift isn't led by politicians or activists, but by ordinary consumers through a simple yet subversive act: ordering something else, picking a different shelf, or canceling an order. Let's start with a name almost everyone knows: McDonald's. Once the weekend gathering place for Canadian families, the familiar post-school stop, the treat for kids, now finds itself facing empty tables and quiet cash registers. People don't publicly criticize McDonald's. There's no loud protest movement. But, in their daily choices, they've spoken a truth that no slogan can reverse. They've grown tired of the brand's presence. Not because the food isn't tasty anymore, but because what comes from America no longer feels as trustworthy as before. In Quebec, where national pride and local loyalty simmer beneath a calm surface, homegrown fast food chains like A&W and Harvey's have seen double-digit growth in a short time. Canadian consumers aren't vegetarians or radical anti-globalists. They simply want to know that the money they spend stays within their community, supporting the values they believe in. And in that landscape, McDonald's simply no longer fits. Similarly, the fracture has spread to Coca-Cola, a name once unbeatable on global beverage shelves. The unsettling part isn't about perceived drops in quality or price. It's that Canadians no longer assume Coca-Cola is the first or only choice. In many restaurants in Ontario, the soft drinks now served are local brands, some of which had never appeared on the radar of American marketing experts. Yet they're chosen, not because of advertising, but because of identity. The identity of "I'm Canadian and I choose our brand." Coca-Cola bottles no longer being opened aren't just hurting local distributors, they're forcing an American supply chain to contract. From a label printing plant in Alabama to a bottling factory in Georgia, order volumes from north of the border are in free fall, not because of a trade war, but a war of trust. And the tragic part is, no one knows where to begin to win that trust back. The retreat of American icons doesn't stop at meals or beverages. It spreads to products with even deeper symbolic value. Jack Daniel's, a whiskey once considered representative of Southern American culture, of rugged charm and American cool. Now it's gradually disappearing from store shelves across Canada. No one is calling for a boycott. But when people start turning to Canadian, Scottish, or Irish whiskey instead, Americans must understand. They're no longer the example the world eagerly imitates or reveres. The core issue isn't the product itself, but the way America, through its corporations, presents itself. They once believed that superior technology, quality, or branding strategy would be enough to keep the world in love with them forever. But Canada, a nation known for measured and polite responses, has shown one simple truth. No symbol is immortal if it no longer reflects the values of the community it serves. When McDonald's sits empty, Coca-Cola disappears from menus, and Jack Daniel's vanishes from liquor shelves. It's not just brands falling. It's part of the American dream being rejected. Once, then twice. Until the silence grows so loud, it becomes a clear declaration. The world no longer needs America to define quality, style, or consumer values. In an era where consumers are increasingly aware of identity, ethics, and the power behind their purchases, the brands that once dominated can no longer survive on reputation alone. They must ask themselves, is there still anyone who wants to walk beside the image they now represent? And if the answer is no, then no matter how famous they are, they won't survive on the shelf. The real consequences aren't happening in Canada, but right on American soil. A burger not ordered in Toronto. A can of Coca-Cola passed over in a Vancouver supermarket. a bottle of Jack Daniels replaced at a bar in Montreal. These may seem like small things, personal choices hardly worth noticing, but it's precisely from these quiet acts that a tremor is steadily rippling across the United States. And this time, the damage isn't just numbers on a financial report. It's work hours being cut, workers being laid off, production lines halting without warning. The boycott of American goods in Canada isn't just a fit of consumer anger. It's a wake-up call aimed straight at the heart of an economic machine that has grown too used to complacency. Because while the U.S. stays entangled in speeches and campaign trails, up north, Canadian consumers have quietly cast another kind of vote, with their wallets. And the results are being tallied right in American states. In Idaho and Nebraska, states known as potato capitals, supplying ingredients for McDonald's Canada, French fry processing plants have had to cut output by 20%. Refrigerated trucks that once departed weekly now sit gathering dust in parking lots. This isn't about Canadians not eating McDonald's anymore. It's Americans losing jobs because Canadians aren't eating McDonald's anymore. In Missouri, a packaging factory, once a key supplier for fast food chains in Canada, was forced to shut down weekend operations, leaving hundreds of workers with reduced hours. No one was prepared for the reality that a small shift in behavior from a neighboring country could send shockwaves deep into the American Midwest, where the livelihoods of millions depend on export contracts once thought to be as certain as destiny. And the fallout isn't limited to food. Coca-Cola's supply chain, organized like a sophisticated web stretching across the southern U.S., is now choking at its early points. A label printing plant in Alabama, a packaging hub in Georgia, a distribution center in Tennessee, all have started reducing output, cutting seasonal contracts. There's no national news coverage, but in small towns, where life depends on every hour of overtime, people are feeling the Canada punch more than any prior trade war. In Tennessee, where Jack Daniels has been distilled since 1866, export volumes to Canada have dropped so sharply that the plant had to cut the number of weekly shipments. There's no ban, no tariff wall, but oak barrels once used for aging now sit stacked in warehouses, untouched, because the North has stopped ordering. For longtime workers in Lynchburg, this isn't just a production hiccup. It's a gut punch, because they never imagined Canadians would be the first to say no. What shocks American policymakers isn't the scale of the damage, but the way it's unfolding, quietly, simultaneously, beyond negotiation. Canada didn't announce sanctions. Consumers didn't rally with signs. They simply stopped choosing. And in today's economy, not choosing is the harshest punishment of all. In Nevada, a parts supplier for Tesla just lost a key export contract to Canada. In Buffalo, New York, a logistics hub serving the Ontario market, warehouses are filling up with goods that have nowhere to go. Every square foot of the United States is beginning to feel colder, not because of weather, but because of a chilling wave of indifference from its northern friend. Americans were once used to being the chosen one, thanks to superior technology, cultural influence, brand power. But the world has changed. True value now lies not in flashy marketing campaigns, but in whether you are still trusted. And Canada, a country once so close it was seen as a friendly replica of America, has now shown that once trust is lost, there's no need for tariff barriers. The market will build its own wall. For the U.S., the painful lesson isn't about losing market share. It's about realizing that what seemed permanent was only temporary. And when your neighbor quietly walks away, it's very likely the rest of the world is silently preparing to follow. When American symbols are no longer default. If a burger can freeze a factory's production line, if a can of soda can shake the distribution system across multiple states, then what happens when products that once represented loyalty, even part of personal memory, are rejected by consumers themselves? The answer is becoming clear on store shelves across Canada. People no longer buy out of habit. They are choosing or not choosing based on principle. And in this quiet but fierce filtering process, many American giants are no longer considered default choices. One of the clearest examples of this shift is the story of Heinz, the ketchup brand once considered a national condiment on both sides of the border. In Leamington, Ontario, once known as the tomato capital of Canada, Heinz was a symbol of pride and employment for the whole community. But then, in a cold-hearted decision, the company moved its entire production line back to the U.S., leaving behind an unemployed town and a generation marked by a sense of abandonment. And Canadians have not forgotten. Since then, instead of Heinz, many families have switched to French's, a domestic brand that previously stood little chance in the market. People didn't choose it for the taste, but for their loyalty to their own community. French's, though smaller, became a new symbol of quiet resistance. On billboards, the sign "Proudly Made in Canada" is not just a brand statement, it's a political message, a way for the public to say, "We no longer believe you." Even when Heinz returned and opened a factory in Canada in 2020, it couldn't erase the scar. Though the packaging now reads "Made in Ontario," consumers still see behind it the shadow of a silent departure. And once trust is fractured, no PR campaign, no matter how costly, can fully mend it. Canadians understand that while a product may return, values do not. Similarly, Tesla, a symbol of innovation, technology, and a sustainable future, is being removed by many Canadians from their vision of what the future looks like. Not because electric cars have lost appeal, but because that car represents someone they no longer want to be associated with. Elon Musk. When consumers feel that a brand's leader no longer reflects their personal values, even if the product works flawlessly, they will turn away. In Quebec, Alan Roy, a man who once owned 2 Teslas and placed a deposit for a Cybertruck, sold everything in just a few days, simply because he didn't want to drive a provocative symbol through his neighborhood. And he's not alone. Canadian consumer forums are filled with stories from former Tesla fans who now drive Hyundai Ioniqs or Polestars, not because the technology is better, but because the choice aligns with their ethics. In a world increasingly sensitive to human values, neutrality is no longer a safe option. A brand cannot stand outside of all social currents and expect consumers to stay loyal out of habit or logo alone. And Tesla, though a technical pioneer, forgot the core truth. People don't just buy a product, they buy the trust behind it. The same thing is happening in other areas, from Oreo cookies to the Netflix platform. Products once tied to childhood memories, family time, and shared emotions are now labeled untrustworthy because of a single bad business decision: moving production to Mexico, restricting account sharing, cutting local investments. Things that once seemed minor, in an age where consumers have long memories and product tracking tools at their fingertips, have become reasons to reject an entire brand. In the end, the frightening part is not that Canada is turning its back. It's that Canada has gone first. They don't shout, they don't rage, they simply stop choosing. And each rejected product is not just a lost order. It's a brick fallen from the tower of trust built over centuries between the two nations. If there was once a time when Made in USA was a mark of guarantee, today it has become a question. And in small cities like Leamington or in garages across Montreal, Canadians are the first to give their answer. Not anymore, not now. When American symbols are removed from everyday life. People often believe that boycotts come from anger, that there must be a scandal, a loud protest campaign, or a political shock. But in Canada, The wave of rejecting American goods didn't begin with hatred, it began with a quiet yet persistent feeling. The feeling of betrayal. No one announced the end of a trust contract. There was no public debate about consumer ethics. But Canadians, once America's most loyal customers, have gradually shifted from neutrality to decisiveness. And what hurts American corporations the most is this: they can't control the reason why, because the reason doesn't lie in the product, it lies in memory. Take Oreo, a brand once thought to be untouchable. It was a symbol of childhood, of movie nights with family, of lunchboxes in school cafeterias. No one ever imagined that a small cookie could become a casualty in a cross-border trust crisis. But that's exactly what's happening. And it shows the depth of the wound Canadians feel. A few years ago, Oreo announced it was moving its production line from the US and Canada to Mexico to cut costs. But in the eyes of Canadian consumers, that message was crystal clear. We're willing to leave you for somewhere cheaper. And when the brand returned to the market, it brought no apology, no show of respect, just stocked the shelves again and waited for forgiveness as if it were automatic. What Oreo lost wasn't quality, it was emotional connection. And in a generation of increasingly conscious consumers, brands tied to memories but no longer to values are the first to be discarded. In Toronto supermarkets, consumers are now choosing lesser-known, less advertised local brands, but ones they find more honest. Some mothers who once bought Oreo for their children every week have now chosen a different cookie for one simple reason: I don't want to build my child's memories with something that turned its back on my community. That sense of betrayal didn't come just from the departure, but from how the return was handled. As if consumers would forget, or worse, weren't worth an explanation. And in an age where social media allows people to verify everything, from a product's origin to a brand's promise, lack of transparency is no longer a forgivable excuse. Similarly, Netflix, a platform that once felt like part of every household during the pandemic, is now caught in a spiral of rejection. The issue wasn't just the crackdown on password sharing, it was how they did it, with no listening, no consideration for Canada's unique cultural reality, where sharing accounts between generations is a form of connection, not fraud. Instead of discussion or flexibility, Netflix enforced a blanket policy, requiring fixed location logins, while Canadian families often span multiple provinces. The result was a mass withdrawal. No shouting, no slogans, just apps being deleted from TVs, credit cards being cancelled, and users switching to other platforms. The consequence wasn't just lost viewers, it was the loss of a community that once saw Netflix as an essential part of daily life. And just like Heinz or Tesla, they didn't fail because the product was bad. They failed because they didn't respect the culture, the memories, and the connections that Canadians hold most dear. That is the heart of this crisis. Canadians aren't against America. They're against the feeling of being dismissed. They were once loyal customers, close partners, a testing ground for American cultural and tech innovation. But when American corporations began behaving as if that affection was automatic, as if it would return no matter how they behaved, that's when a quiet divorce began to unfold. And now, each product left behind on the shelf is not just an unsold item, it's a fracture in what was once the continent's strongest relationship. A cookie, a streaming service, a soda, once symbols of trust, have now become living proof of one truth. Trust is not something that can be restored with a marketing campaign. The new power of Canadian consumers. If in the past consumption was seen as a private matter, a choice purely based on price, advertising, and habit, then today, every swipe of a card, every item lifted from a supermarket shelf, has become a statement. And in Canada, where politeness is part of the national identity, a movement with no leader, no banners, no name, is quietly reshaping the regional trade map. Consumers are using their power intelligently, persistently, and strategically. These are no longer reflexive decisions. They buy, or don't, based on a new set of criteria: where the product comes from, how the brand treats the community, and whether that choice reflects the values they believe in. This is no longer an emotional boycott. It's a conscious consumer campaign, unfolding silently yet spreading faster than any marketing strategy ever launched by American corporations. Take Nike as an example. A brand that was once the dream of entire generations. A pair of Air Jordans or a shirt with the swoosh logo once symbolized self-assertion, style, and youth. But now, those very young people are leading the movement to reject the brand. Not because the design is less appealing, not because the quality has dropped, but because they're asking a seemingly simple question that has no satisfying answer. Why should I pay over $150 to wear a product that won't even disclose its ethical origins? In an age where transparency is a weapon, accusations about Nike's supply chain in Asian factories, where labor conditions are suspected of exploitation, have become a serious blow to the brand image. And even if the company refutes, denies, or presents counter-evidence, Canadian consumers have responded in the most definitive way possible. They've stopped buying. Sporting goods stores in Montreal, Toronto, and Calgary are quietly clearing Nike products from their shelves to make room for more transparent domestic or international brands. This shift doesn't stem from hating America, but from a clear mindset: we don't buy logos, we choose values. And with that mindset, Canadian youth are rewriting the consumption habits of an entire generation. From shopping malls to online consumer forums, a new language is forming. It's the language of awareness. They're not seeking flashiness, they're seeking resonance. A shoe may be beautiful, but if it comes from silence in the face of injustice, that beauty becomes hollow. And what's surprising is that this movement needs no leadership, no propaganda. It spreads by not spreading, through silence, through every canceled order, through the growing emptiness in American distribution centers. In Oregon, the once busy Nike shoe factory now operates only 4 days a week. In Minnesota, a distribution center serving Eastern Canada is seeing inventory pile up each quarter. Meanwhile, Wall Street investors are becoming more cautious every time Nike announces its international earnings, because now consumers are no longer loyal to brands, but to principles. And perhaps that is the biggest shift. In the past, corporations believed that as long as they kept up their image, customers would never leave. But in Canada, a new generation is proving they don't need the image, they need the truth. The truth that a shirt, a pair of shoes, a can of soda, a streaming app, all carry a part of the owner's values. And if those values aren't clear, aren't transparent, or worse, contradict community trust, then no matter how good the product is, it will be left behind. Canadian consumers have awakened, and they are choosing again, not out of trend, but out of awareness. And in this cold, rational reevaluation, American brands that once dominated are no longer assumed to be must-haves. To stay, they must be worthy. To survive, they must learn to listen. Because every canceled order today is not just a consumer response, but a silent, unmistakable warning. We no longer buy with emotion. We buy with principles. Canada is no longer alone in its retreat from America. It's time for the United States to ask itself, is Canada's silence just a temporary phenomenon? Or is it a leading signal of a broader wave quietly forming? When the closest friends begin to turn away, not with criticism, but with resolute consumer choices, this is no longer a trade disagreement. It's a cultural signal. a signal that the global trust once reserved for America is no longer a given. And the most concerning part is, Canada is no longer alone. Look to Europe, where once American brands reigned as irreplaceable icons. Today, in cities like Amsterdam, Berlin, or Lyon, you'll easily spot fashion stores from Denmark, mineral water from France, or entertainment platforms from Germany being favored over Silicon Valley's giants. The reason isn't poor product quality from America, but rather that European consumers are seeking options that feel less imposing. A soft yet deeply meaningful reflex. I'm not against you, but I no longer want to carry your image. In Asia, the same is unfolding. In Japan and South Korea, countries that idolized American culture for decades, the younger generations are now returning to local values, local brands, and cultural models untouched by Hollywood. And they're doing this not because they're ungrateful to America, but because they feel it's time to stop borrowing America's image to define themselves. In Australia, according to a 2024 Lowy Institute survey, trust in the U.S. government as a strategic ally has dropped to its lowest since 2008. In the consumer sphere, platforms like Amazon, Facebook, and Disney Plus are witnessing the quiet withdrawal of hundreds of thousands of users each quarter, especially following moves perceived as abusive, violating privacy, or disrespecting local labor. And all of these movements are following the first crack that Canada made, because Canada is not just a neighbor, but the closest version of a beloved America. Same language, same economic system, same democracy. When Canada begins to question its trust in the U.S., it shows that if a close friend feels distant, then longtime acquaintances will soon reconsider. Within the U.S. itself, signs are also beginning to show. Movements like Buy Local, Union Strong, or Ethical Supply are no longer slogans of radical groups, but are steadily becoming core consumer mindsets in states like Vermont, Oregon, and even California, the heart of American tech. Americans are beginning to scrutinize their own products, from production origins and labor practices to environmental impact, and, alarmingly, they're starting to act like Canadians. They are rejecting. They are choosing again. They are demanding that American brands sell not just goods, but also respect, transparency, and ethics, something they once assumed came standard. This is no longer a traditional trade war, but a renegotiation of trust between America and those who once stood closest to it. Each pair of shoes left on a shelf, each canceled subscription, each factory forced to reduce hours, these all ring the same bell. No one is immune from rejection, not even America. The days when the world needed America to define value are over. Now, the world only needs a reason to choose differently. And the painful truth is, they have enough reasons. Not out of hatred, but because it no longer fits. And if Americans fail to see that in Canada's quiet but firm withdrawal, then what comes next may no longer be a warning, but a verdict, not on the products, but on how a superpower lost the most precious element in global commerce, the trust of its closest friend.